Okay. Assalamu alaikum. We're going to start the Q&A session. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, alhamdulillah. Okay, I wanted to just quickly start by thanking Dr. Rania for a powerful and enlightening talk this evening. Your insights on the history of mental health have been very important for us, and it's meaningful and important that as a community we acknowledge the importance of taking care of ourselves and the correlation with Islam and Islamic teachings related to mental health. So we will start with the questions and answers for the next 15 or so minutes. And our first question tonight is there a course of study with a definitive curriculum that would allow us to understand the Islamic approach to therapy better, preferably online?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you for the question. Sounds like somebody's interested in doing clinical mental health care work, which is excellent. And you're asking about a curriculum in which, from what I understand, you're trying to integrate Islam into the therapy process. One of the books that we wrote with a couple of my colleagues is a book that you can find online. It's actually published by Routledge, and you can buy it from Amazon. It's called Applying Islamic Principles to Clinical Mental Health Care, introducing the TIIP model, traditionally Islamically integrated psychotherapy. So this is a curriculum of study. It's a book, it's a manual essentially, in which we have figured out a modality of therapy in which we integrate Islamic teachings within it for someone who actually wants therapy from an Islamic psychology perspective. And this training also comes with, this book also comes with trainings. There are 4 levels of training that you can sign up with, the TIIP trainings, to then become certified in this domain. So I hope that's useful to you. There's some other programs out there. I teach at the Cambridge Muslim College's diploma for Islamic psychology. That's a year-long or 10-month diploma, part-time, in Islamic psychology as another option. And there's a few other of these programs that allow you to do training with a set curriculum of how it is that you learn how to integrate Islamic principles into therapy, inshallah. If you're trying to find any of these resources, go to the lab's website and you'll see all of the publications and the work there, inshallah.
Jazakallah. If someone has been diagnosed with a mental health disability that affects their ability to pray, how do they go about getting an Islamic opinion or ruling about so?
This is definitely something that requires a personalized opinion, meaning a fatwa. And so the person would need to find a mufti, a person who's able to hear out the condition, and also you need the Islamic perspective and you need the medical or psychiatric perspective, because each side has their own discipline and ability to understand, is this person truly at a point where they're unable to pray? If you look at any of the books of fiqh, in any of the sections, right, whether it's tahara, purification, prayer, salah, sawm, fasting, and so on, one of the very first prerequisite criteria for prayer, for fasting, so on, is aql, the soundness of mind. And if a person has reached a point, this is where you need the psychiatric medical opinion, has reached a point where they are no longer of sound mind, meaning they're irrational thinking, they're not thinking rationally any longer, that first prerequisite lifts them potentially from the fara'id, such as prayer, such as fasting, and so on. But that cannot be determined by you as a parent or you as a loved one or even you yourself. That actually has to be determined by a tabib, adil, right, an actual physician who is upright and sound of opinion to be able to say this person has reached a point medically or psychiatrically, they're no longer rational in this point in time. And then the mufti would be able to give a specific customized opinion for them. It's not a general opinion that I could just say here. It actually has to be specific. That's what a fatwa is, a specific time, place, and person that the ruling is for, to say this is exempt for you until you improve, either by medications or therapy or whatever may happen to bring you back to a state of rational thinking again. So I do encourage both things to happen. You need a religious consultation along with a psychiatric consultation to be able to come to a conclusion on whether or not prayer is obligatory or fasting or whatever of the fara'id the question is being asked on.
How can we bridge gaps among families when our parents are dealing with their own childhood traumas or come from different cultures and values?
Yeah, I appreciate this question as well. And you're right. I mean, there is such a thing in our scientific research and studies that talk about intergenerational trauma. It's now kind of a well-accepted concept that trauma does actually transfer from generation to generation. And if you're familiar with the term epigenetics, like even on a genetic DNA chemical basis, trauma literally is passed genetically down. But you can intervene and actually help kind of mitigate that if you're able to kind of really take this seriously and make sure that the trauma is healed in you so that it's not continuously passing down from generation to generation. Well, that starts with, like you said, the question was on families and culture and such who who do not are willing to admit or willing to engage in the mental health system, and they're carrying a lot of trauma either because of their own family situation, how they grew up, maybe there was something traumatic in it, or because it was a war, a famine, something happened, natural disaster that caused that trauma, and it was never dealt with or processed. And where is it going to go? It's just going to fester under the surface. And the way trauma works is that it's suddenly, out of the blue sometimes, you go on in life, you keep going on, and then something triggers it. Something out of the blue sometimes, just suddenly all that trauma comes back again because it was never actually processed and dealt with. So if a person had abuse in their life in the past, or maybe they dealt with, like I said, the trauma of war, they could be going about their life doing okay, having just pushed it under the surface. But then suddenly they hear something, they see something, they smell something, it reminds them of that incident again, and the trauma is back out of nowhere. And kind of like really kind of, they spiral because of it. And so we advocate strongly that when people have dealt with traumas and issues, that they actually deal with them. And especially for our older generation, right? And as much as I've tried to have this conversation with elders of my own family and to say, this is important because even if you feel you don't need this and you've powered through this and you can do it, you don't know what you're passing on to the next generations. And that's very important to kind of stem and break that cycle. And so if it's not for you, then at least for them, essentially, right? And so this is where I really encourage both individual, but also family types of counseling to really address some of these issues that are definitely in our communities.
What are your thoughts on the main factors that affect the underutilization of mental health services in the Muslim community?
Yeah, a lot of our research kind of looks at this. In fact, the very study that I had up here earlier was looking at many things is perceptions and attitudes towards mental health. Part of the work that we see is what are the hurdles, what are the barrier points of getting help. A lot of times it's actually lack of education, meaning misunderstandings or misconceptions around mental health. The reason I took a very deen-based approach from the Quran and the Sunnah is because this is our deen, this is our Quran and Sunnah. And if we agree with the ahadith, the ad'iyah, and the verses of the Quran that were presented here, then we agree with mental health care is what I'm trying to say. And so, sometimes it's just a lack of understanding or a misconception, kind of like what I had. That's why I shared my personal story. I had all kinds of misconceptions about psychology and psychiatry, a lot of stigma internalized against it. But as I came to study and came to learn, I came to understand, actually there's some benefit, not all of it, some of it's hocus pocus. Freud is garbage. But Freud has also been largely debunked in the psychology field. I mean, there are very few in the world now Freudians at all. So sometimes you get stuck on this and you're like, that garbage, right? Not realizing that there's a lot more in the discipline that actually is beneficial and was used today. So sometimes it's lack of education and misconceptions. Sometimes it's also there wasn't a culture of getting support and help. Often when we say to like our elders and others, and then they say, what? You're going to go talk about our family to a stranger? How dare you? What happens in the family stays in the family, right? That kind of concept. But that goes against the ayah in the Quran that we mentioned, right? Of asking ahl al-dhikri, right? فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ, right? You're supposed to ask the people of knowledge if you don't know how to deal with that issue that's transpired. And so some of this also is a resistance from a cultural perspective, not from the deen perspective, because I can't find anything in the deen that tells us not to seek out mental health care. If anything, the Muslims were the pioneer for mental health and treatment because they understood it's important to treat all aspects of yourself, mind, body, and soul. And they have these amazing institutions, the first in the world, the Madistans, to be able to put in mental health holistic treatment efforts. So it's not coming from the deen. It's coming usually from culture. Usually the resistance there is, we never did that, that's not how our family did it, that's not how my parents did it. But it's not that every generation knew how to do it right. right? And I hope we can actually do better and go back to a revival of what our deen had been. Another barrier I would say is access to care. So that usually comes down to where are the Muslim therapists? Where are the Muslim providers? And is it enough to just be Muslim in name doing therapy? That's a big can of worms, but I'll just say this much. I clearly have a bias because I do a lot of Islamic psychology, and Islamic psychology is starting with the Quran and the Sunnah, and you build psychology up from it, versus starting from the top down, which basically is you take a Western psychology model and you try to Islamicize some of it, right? Throw a little ayat here, throw a little Quran in there, and make what's out there in the field Islamicized. I'm more interested in a grounds-up approach, which starts with the Quran and Sunnah and then build upon it. That's Islamic psychology. So is it enough to have a Muslim who's, that's their background, and learn the Western modalities, and is that sufficient? It's better than nothing. At least when you try to say to them, I need to take Eid off, they understand what Eid is, right? Like you're not starting from scratch. But if they're not bringing true Islamic content into the therapeutic process, or they're putting up barriers on discussing spirituality, the deen, connection, using things like prayer, dhikr, salah to actually improve your state, I believe it's not fully sufficient. So this is why we wrote the book on the modality of Islamic psychotherapy and do these trainings. So these are usually the barriers that I see. Sometimes it's financial. It could be the lack of insurance, the lack of having the finances. Therapy's not cheap. A lot of therapists don't take insurance, so it's usually out-of-pocket expense. But if a person has an insurance plan that allows for, what do you call it? No, I can't think of the term. Somebody who's out of your network.
Oh, out of network.
An out-of-network provider, where you can pay upfront and then get your insurance to reimburse you for the therapy sessions. Another way to really think about this, and this is what, out of the last decade now, we've built a lot of services in the San Francisco Bay Area where I live. And so in our masjid, we actually have within the masjid a counseling center. We have a branch of Madistan actually in the masjid. And the reason it's there is because it's accessible. People trust the masjid and trust the people within it. Maybe half of our community, they will not send their child or themselves to therapy unless it's actually part of the masjid process. And maybe the other half of our community doesn't want anything to do with the masjid when it comes to mental health. So we have other services that are actually in like a typical medical clinic, right? And then teletherapy. So sometimes it's access, sometimes it's financial. And I really hope and encourage that all of the masajid, all these communities that are interested in having conversations like this on mental health, to see some of the blueprints we put together and how do you have a functional mental health counseling center and clinic, how do you have educational programs in the community so you can start to raise up and give the services, make them available. We are very charitable as a Muslim community. All the studies and research on charity shows Muslims are very charitable, generous people. And I do believe that if we start to think about how you put whether it's zakat or sadaqah, in other than what you typically give for. So a lot of times it's refugees, a lot of times it's orphans, a lot of times it's disasters, natural disasters, a lot of times it's family and friends overseas, and so on. I do believe, and I feel very strongly, taking from the example of the Madistans and the Awqaf, the endowments that they set up, there has to be a portion of our funds that actually goes into the social services, that goes into things like dollars for mental health counseling for those who can't afford it, that goes into work related to domestic violence, that goes into work related to other forms of substances and addiction, that goes into the social services. Our communities, we put a lot of money in, may Allah bless the older generations that actually built these buildings, and we stand on their shoulders to do any of the work we do. But that was a generation back in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. It's time now to start investing in the people themselves and putting our sadaqah and our zakat into social services that actually build out the type of support your kids and my kids need kind of going forward. They don't need as many buildings anymore. They need actual services at this point, inshallah ta'ala.
How do you start to help or direct a friend who was physically abused as a child, yet due to the stigma finds it hard to see a psychiatrist or therapist?
Read the first part for me again. Yeah, I'm really sorry to hear that. That's very difficult, what's written in the question. I want to tell you the first rule of therapy that we always teach as professionals. The first rule of therapy is you cannot change someone else. You cannot force someone else. You cannot change someone else. And people do not like hearing this when it's about their family or their friends. And they always feel like, no, I have to, I should, I have to. And the reality is you can inspire change in someone else, but you can't actually change them. They have to be ready to take that step for themselves. If they allow, like the friend here who's asking, if they allow you to help them in that process, you can be a major help, such as you could say, can I look up therapists who are trauma-informed to help you with the trauma that you went through? Can I help you make the calls? Because there's so many wait lists. Can I just help you make the calls and get yourself on a wait list? Can I just sit there and be there with you while you make the calls, just to give you mutual support, right? You can offer like ancillary, tangential things, but you can't force them into therapy and care until they're ready to do so. And the American legal system, unfortunately, is one, has its pros and its cons, but one of the things about here is once a person is over the age of 18, you cannot force anything on anybody in our medical system and psychiatric system. So the best we can do is kind of like give support and care to then help them take the next steps for care, inshallah ta'ala. Because maybe the barrier is they didn't know who to go to, or they couldn't afford it, or they weren't sure if anybody was going to judge them. But if you can help them bridge those gaps, inshallah, they'll get the care they need, inshallah. And don't underestimate the power of dua. Dua, dua, dua. Dua is amazing. It's literally the weapon of the Muslim, the believer, right? And it helps overturn things that we thought could never be overturned. So, Ya Rab.
So with that, as a community, how can we help break down some of these taboos surrounding mental health? We know that you cannot force someone to seek therapy, but is there something that we can do as a broader community?
Definitely, definitely. This is why I mentioned and put up all the resources earlier, because take it from communities that are a little bit more ahead in this conversation, as in to say, we've written a lot on the blueprints of how do you set up educational programs in a community? How do you have khutbahs that are cycling every so often that actually bring up mental health content? Imagine from the mimbar right here, imagine it's September, which is Suicide Awareness and Prevention Month, and from the mimbar, the imam literally, one of his 4 khutbahs of that month is actually on suicide prevention. It's amazing. It's the kind of thing you don't want to wait until a tragedy happens to then start scrambling and figuring out what to do. We need to be more upstream and more preventative work, not reactionary all the time. There's also the idea of having family sessions, kind of like this, where it's like family night and everyone comes and there's consistent programming on these topics that are sometimes taboo or difficult topics. As long as they're coming from an Islamic lens, we shouldn't keep them as taboo. I mentioned earlier, even when people want to get care for something that they know it was hard and an addiction they were trying to like push out of the way, they literally have to go to church to get help. That shouldn't be our reality. Do you see what I'm saying? Not in 2025. Do you know, mashallah? I do hope that we start to get better. The community then can have regular programming. The fact that you all formed a committee is amazing, because it means now that there's going to be a group of people who are responsible for figuring out what is the programming. How do we get a clinic up and running? How do we get a list of all the Muslim mental health providers of our area? How do we make sure that there's actually, it's not just lip service or just one lecture that, I fly out tomorrow morning, inshallah, right? And it's done, the conversation's over. No, it's actually something that is consistently happening until we start to see real change happen, bi'idhnillah. Ya Rab.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Rania. With that, this concludes the end of our Q&A session. Sorry.
You want to take anything in the crowd or no?
Do you want to? I don't know. You should be open to that. Okay. Dr. Rania is generous with her time, so she wants to know, is there anyone from the crowd here that has any questions that they would like to ask live? Okay.
Sorry, you're running again.
No, it's okay. Alhamdulillah. Doctor, thank you very much. I learned a lot from you tonight. There was another Syrian American that I've also learned a lot throughout my life. His name was Steve Jobs, and he also suffered from a lot of mental health issues. So I do think that when it comes to mental health, I believe we're looking at the branches of the tree. I believe we're not looking at the trunk or even the root cause of the problem. Because to me, Islam is not religion, it's a deen. And when you look at the etymology of that word, the dal, ya, noon, it's actually encompassing of not just spirituality, but also justice and economic aspects of the system. And so I think we're being asked by the world over, by Western economists, by our parents, and especially by these so-called Islamic scholars, I'm sorry to say, who are holding us hostage, to only focus on that little small percentage of the religion and neglecting the economic and justice aspects of the system, which is then leading to both upstream and downstream problems, upstream meaning recessions, and then downstream meaning suicide, addiction, etc. So Islam to me is an economic system which was prescribed by the Prophet to be the most compatible economic and life system with the natural economic system of this planet. I think we need to learn not just, about the micro aspects, because Muhammad, peace be upon him, he preached from the start to the end mostly about the macro aspects of a society's problems. It is now being forced upon us to focus on the micro aspects, the ritualistic aspects, which are a very small percentage of the religion. And I think that's actually leading to what my question is going to be, which is, to me, mental health isn't necessarily a medical problem, it is a marketing and sales problem actually, because we have all of these Bimaristans around the world. We in fact have one very close to where you live. It's called Isalan Institute, which was started out by, frankly speaking, a bunch of hippies who think that you can just make these spiritual centers, these ashrams, and then hope for people to get better. But these are of course based on the concept of Bimaristans. So my question is, why, doctor, is there any kind of research being done today on the hesitance as to why the wider world does not want to adopt this economic model and instead goes with the current modern capitalistic model, which thrives on using dopamine as an engine of growth? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question and the comments. And though Steve Jobs was Syrian American, I'm actually not. But that's okay. I get Syrian all the time. I did want to say that I appreciate your thinking through this. I do believe that our deen is many, many aspects, layers and layers of things, one of which is economic understandings and economic justice. But there's also other layers of things. So I just want to just very briefly do a little corrective piece there and then answer your question. The little corrective piece has to do with, you said the small percentage that focuses on ritualistic. I agree that there's a lot of hyper focus on the ritualistic aspects, but they must be there. Because if they are not there, that is the very foundation, the pillars of this faith. If they are not there and we're kind of talking and swimming and dancing around up here without actually doing the fara'id, right, the core ritualistic aspects, it's not Islam anymore. One time I gave a talk to all psychiatrists. It was the Northern California Society of Psychiatrists, and I spoke about religion and psychiatry. I get off the stage and I go sit in my seat, and the lady who's doing the microphones, all the tech stuff in the back, kind of waves me down, and so I come over to her and she goes, "Assalamu alaikum," and I say, "Alaikum assalam." She doesn't necessarily look immediately Muslim to me, and she goes, "Oh, I'm a Sufi," and I say, "Okay." I said, "So what do you do? Like, what's your story?" And she goes, No, I'm not a Muslim. I'm a Sufi." And I say, "You can't be a Sufi without being a Muslim," right? And she said, No. Our teacher and our people, we don't practice any of the deen. We just do all the spiritual stuff. That's not Islam, right? So it's like we don't want to also divorce the actual rituals from the faith itself, because it's part and parcel what anchors the faith. But I agree with you so much about this idea of, could it be something that's all marketing and pushing something? I also have an issue with that kind of conceptualization of mental health in the field. And while there is a marketing aspect of it, and while there is a push for big pharma, and while there is a push for the dopamine rush and all the rest that you mentioned, the reality is these conditions, as we showed in the research and the work, have been around since the beginning of mankind, right? They're there, but how you deal with them makes a difference. The Badistans that I was talking about, one of the key aspects of the financial aspect of it is, it was always free of charge. There was nothing commercialized about this. There was no money being made off the backs of this. These were individuals or the rulers of the land or wealthy families or individuals who endowed by a waqf lillahi ta'ala. Once you give that money as an endowment, it's not yours anymore. It's Allah's, right? And it was free services to the people who were most in need. That is economic justice. Instead of this runaround that we're trying to figure out, does your insurance take it? Can you go here? Oh no, I have Kaiser. What do I do? Right? Like all this runaround of trying to find. It would be amazing if wealthy individuals said, that's going to be my sadaqah jariyah, such as we had in the historical Muslim past. That's going to be my charitable thing. I'm going to put this services here to allow for this so that all people can access care. That is so part and parcel of our tradition. There's not a single Madistan that charged money for what they were doing. And that to me is Islam, if that makes sense. So I hope that helps a little bit shape some of the discussion, but I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Before the next question, if I ask the parents for the kids upstairs to make them quiet, please, because the noise level downstairs is high as they run upstairs. Jazakumullah khair. Any question from the ladies' side? Okay. Start with the...
Okay, assalamu alaikum. So you did talk about how therapists can prepare, they can mesh Islam into the therapy. But is there a contradiction between the way therapy is done in the United States and our Islamic teachings?
Yep.
Did that make sense?
I'm told this works. Okay, alhamdulillah. Yes, sometimes there can be. And there are people who've shared, honestly, horror stories of therapy. And the reason is, this is what I would say is the minority times. It happens. And it's not supposed to happen because most therapists who are licensed professionals are supposed to be professionals, which means they have cultural competence, right? And they're not going to judge your deen or judge your hijab or judge your Islam for the issues that are happening in your life. But certainly there have been. I had a couple come to me one time, and I was seeing the woman specifically, and they said that they had gone to a marriage family therapist for some marriage issues they were dealing with, and she took one look at her in hijab and she said, you're oppressed, right? Like just straight up like that. Like, where is the cultural competence in the story, right? So yes, you're gonna have horror stories, that's for sure. In terms of modalities of treatment, many of them are actually somewhat okay, as in to say cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, things related to psychodynamic therapy. Most of these, with a little bit of fine-tuning, are actually fine. I'm not a fan necessarily of things like the analysis and dream interpretation and like old school psychology where people are laying on a couch and people still think that that's how it goes. That's very, very small today. You barely ever find an analyst anymore. The field has moved much more into scientific understandings, clinical trials and research that shows what's effective. But it's devoid of spirituality. I didn't mention to you the newest book that we're working on now that we finished the Madistan book. The newest book that we've signed a contract for is actually an indigenous Islamic alternative to mindfulness meditation. And the idea of mindfulness meditation is so common. Every physician, every psychiatrist, every family medicine doctor, every therapist literally prescribes mindfulness as a form. And there's a lot of research behind it that it calms the person down and helps them get through their difficulties. The issue that I have, and the reason we're writing a whole book on this, is because it's originally from a Buddhist origin, then secularized and made into a clinical practice. And I'm not saying it's not beneficial, but what I am saying is it's not from our tradition. So this idea of fully clearing your mind and focusing just on you and the or whatever it is they do, is just not from our deen. Our deen has much more impressive and outstanding forms of dhikr and meditating, contemplating, tafakkur. Oh, I didn't say this either. The Ramadan series Madistan is doing, if you guys are following, is actually going to be on tafakkur. The entire 15-episode series this Ramadan is on tafakkur. Contemplation, how do you actually do this? How do you do this in a state of i'tikaf when you're in i'tikaf? How do you do this on an everyday basis to calm yourself down? There's much better for a Muslim from within our deen than outside of it, if that makes sense. Inshallah.
Any questions from the gentleman's side? Okay, we have back. Oh, I'll get that next.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us today. A quick question: what are the resources available for premarital counseling for a youth who are planning to get married, especially online availability? I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think premarital counseling is actually very, it's imperative, like it has to happen. in a different generation than in the past when there was a lot of places that you can vet a person. This family asks a million questions about this side of the other family asks a million questions about them. And, when my parents got married, there was a whole way of doing this, and you ask everybody. You ask the butcher and you ask the candle maker, and you ask the shoemaker. Like, you ask everybody on that. So what was this person, the shab, like, what was he actually like? What is this woman actually like? We just don't have that today. And with the virtual world, there's so much that's there that you don't really know what people are like until you're actually living with them. And so part of this, the premarital counseling, a lot of it that's offered, I'll give you the resources in a moment, I'll kind of list some of them out, but what is premarital counseling? A lot of it is actually communication. Figuring out modalities of communication, differences, and also compatibility between people. So some of the resources I want to give you earlier today, I mentioned a book. It's by Imam Muhammad Majid and Salma Abu Ghudairi. It's called Before You Tie the Knot. Before You Tie the Knot. So they have these questions that really should be discussed back and forth between two people who are thinking of getting married to one another. And if some of them are a little sensitive, it would be good to have somebody there that's able to mediate some of those conversations and questions. If you're looking for programs, there's a couple of different places that offer premarital counseling. Previously, I had been with the Khalil Center. They still offer premarital counseling. Also, there's an organization called Ihsan Therapy, maybe, or something. They also offer Islamic premarital counseling. And then there's Sister Nadira, who's in Arizona, and she has an entire weekend program. She offers it every so often in the year, where you can go and actually work on this premarital questions and counseling. So these are all different resources to look at. I'm trying to remember. Let me look it up for a minute. It's Sister Nadira out of Arizona. Let me just tell you what her program's name is. One second. Sister Anissa, sorry. Yeah. But in the meantime, we can take the next question. I'll look it up. I'll look it up for you as I figure out the last name.
One more questions from the ladies' side before I take one. Okay, so here and then there.
Assalamu alaikum. My question is, can we know the name of your professor that you mentioned in your story?
I forgot to say it, didn't I? I'm so sorry. I left you hanging. Cliffhanger. So I'm going to spell you his name. His last name is, but he's the guy who wrote all the OCD books, if you look it up, okay? His last name is spelled Koran. Doctor of Quran. He's not Muslim. It just happens to be his name, Larry Quran. So, yeah, I always took it as a Fal Hassan. MashaAllah. Sorry for the cliffhanger.
Yeah. Assalamu alaikum, sister. Thank you for visiting us. My question is, so when you're dealing with hearing trauma stories and difficult stories from people, how do you separate yourself from your personal life, from your therapy life? And kids who are looking to do similar, psychiatry, psychology and whatnot, how should they prepare for themselves, whether this is the right field for them, whether they'll be able to mentally handle this field or not. So could you give some guidance on that? Thank you.
Yeah, happy to. And I really am not, people come up to me all the time, they're like, I'm going to go into the mental health field. I'm going to become a therapist. I'm going to become a psychiatrist. And I'm like, take good care of yourself. I never push people into this field because it is a heavy field that you carry. It is true. And not every personality and temperament is cut out for it. But I will say this, I asked my teacher one time, I was like, I have session after session after session after session, how do I like keep my head above water? Because every session is difficult things that I'm hearing and listening to. And she gave this beautiful advice where she said, make sure in between every session there's at least a little bit of dhikr or a little bit of Quran, just put yourself a spiritual shield before you go into the next thing. And I never forgot that, and I think it's such a powerful kind of piece because it ties into the point that I want to make, that in order to prepare yourself for a field like this, you know that you are carrying other people and you're helping them through. But if you are not well, how are you going to make anybody else well, right? And so there's a lot of self-care and self-work that has to happen, not selfish, self-care, because then it helps a person know their limits and their boundaries, when to pause, when to take stop, and when not to take so much on in terms of clients, and when they're able to move forward. The field itself does a lot of work professionally in teaching you how to have that thicker skin, how to separate family from work, how to not bring all of that home with you, so to say, right? There's a lot of good professional boundaries that they teach, and a lot of work on supervision. You have a lot of hours. If you become a therapist, even at the master's level, it's 3,000 hours of supervised clinical care, which means you have a supervisor who's going through every single one of those hours of therapy with you before you're even able to sit for a licensing exam. And that's powerful because you have somebody older who's kind of guiding you through some of this and helping you sort it out, not just the books. So it actually, the field itself helps protect some of this too. So I wouldn't be too worried about it because there are, protection mechanisms within it. But grounding oneself in one's deen is very important. And people ask me all the time, especially if they're interested in Islamic psychology, I say, you can't do Islamic psychology without having studied Islam. So just as you are studying your master's or your PhD or your MD, let's say in this field, you have to also have an equivalent amount of Islamic studies at the bachelor's, master's, or PhD level, right, in order to be able to really do this work properly. So just some thoughts, inshallah, for those who are interested in the field. One more?
Any more questions? Okay.
To follow up on your last point, how do you balance the amount of time that it takes to go through medical training with the amount of time that it would also take to get that equivalent Islamic training?
It's all a journey. It's all a process. The way we study here is that it's like you have to do it all in a row, back to back to back. It's got to be elementary school, middle school, high school, college, bam, 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 and graduate school, all in a row. And I was sharing about earlier, I have a program within my lab for mentees who are actually wanting to go into the mental health field, but they're researchers who want to become clinicians as well. And I always tell that group of people, I want you to take a gap year. I want you to take some time between your high school and college, between your college and your graduate school, between graduate school and working. Take some time, invest in yourself, go study the deen. So for me, it was a parallel process. I was doing my back and forth trips to Syria and studying all through high school, college, and medical school, even into my residency before the war broke out. But it's continuous because a talib al-ilm or talabat al-ilm is a talib al-ilm for life. You never stop learning, you never stop studying, right? So it doesn't have to all happen and crammed right here, right now, but you do have to make and carve out space for it. So one class a semester, that's deen-based, right? One program or 1 year in a gap year in which you're doing an intensive 1-year seminary or 1-year kind of program to really ground yourself. Then you go back into your medical studies and you take a little bit of time. It's possible. In fact, if anything, I would say, having sat on some of these admissions committees, the idea of a well-rounded person and real life experience, some of these gap years help you. It actually looks better on your application because you didn't just go from school to school to school. You actually took time into the real world and did something that was grounding. So I encourage you to think about that and ground yourself, inshallah ta'ala.
More questions? Last chance. I think that's it. Oh. Okay.
Go Brother Haki and then
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
One of the challenges that we faced as a family, we lost our son to suicide in November. He took, and one of the challenges we found, mentioned it earlier, when they turn 18, you can't force them to go get help. Our children have always had therapists because mental illness runs on my wife's side of the family, so we made sure that they had a therapist early. But one of the challenges we found as parents is trying to get the children, I don't think their brains, his brain was developed enough to explain, like if he bumps his elbow, knee hurts, hey, I'm hurting here, but they had a hard time communicating the pain mentally. He was diagnosed with depression and he lost his battle with depression. So getting children to be able to explain this part that's painful is very, very challenging. I just wanted to put that out. The other question I have for you is there research that's being done or has been done to show the connection between these phones these children have and their mental health? Thank you.
First, may Allah bless you and your family. We pray for your son, inshallah. And if I hope everybody here actually takes a moment and just makes a dua at this moment for, inshallah, his forgiveness and his ability to reach Jannah, and the patience for his family. Ya Rabbi, Ameen. I'm really sorry to hear of your family's struggle and such a difficult reality, Ya Allah. And you're right, the legal system here does not help. And I feel very much like we need our own internal system within our own communities and masajid to try to safeguard and to catch and to see, catch things earlier, because if we rely solely on the system here, it's unfortunately a broken system. Your question about social media, phones, all this, subhanAllah, there is some research being done on this actually. In fact, unfortunately, there's also been a series of deaths by suicide from kids, really young people, even under 18, who are in these virtual relationships with AI type people. I don't know what you call them, entities. They're not real people. And some of it is very sinister. And even if it's not to that effect, it's just constantly being on social media and living in this virtual bubble where everyone seems happy and everyone's life seems perfect, and you don't see the background that is actually chaotic in their life. That's never posted on the social media, right? And so there's a lot of research, but it's just emerging, like it's just starting, kind of to start to make these connections between mental health conditions, even suicidality and death by suicide from the connection. It's not all bad, because there's also benefit in some of this too. So there needs to be like a carrying, a kind of a balance between both. I'm not an advocate of saying take all phones away and take all social media away, because it's like, the way I think of it is like, this is a train that has already left the station, right? Like when cars were invented, there people were worried about that, but it's not like you can tell somebody don't drive, right? Like us, we adapted to the fact that cars are part of the system. We adapt now to the fact that there's this entity called these phones in our hands, but we teach ourselves and our kids boundaries and modalities, and the healthiest ways is what they see us doing. So if they constantly see us scrolling, they're going to do the same, right? So there's the healthy teaching mechanisms need to be taught, and I hope that's more of what we see happening soon. Thank you for your discussion, mashallah.
One last question, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum. I was just saying that, Jazakallah khair for your time, and even from California and then extending it tonight. I was just saying that on the Slido I was reading, there's so many super heavy questions. I don't know if they can be answered at a later time. I think that people, I don't know if they left or not, but they probably don't want to raise their hand. When I was reading them, they probably wouldn't, it's probably for confidentiality, they're using the Slido. I don't know if you want to look at one or two of those real quick, because it's pretty sad when I was reading them.
Where's our moderator with the Slido? Okay, so the moderators are actually saying that, yes, you're absolutely right, there were some heavy questions, and there were some questions asked by individuals that they then were able to talk to directly and address directly those questions with those individuals. So maybe there was some wisdom behind which questions were asked here in the general audience and which then individuals were addressed directly. So that's my understanding from the organizers, yes? Okay, inshallah. But thank you for pointing that out. I didn't actually see them all myself. But I hope everybody who does have questions gets them answered. And if anybody needs to ask another couple questions privately after this, I can, stay for a few more minutes. But there are also other mental health professionals in the room right now, right here, that are part of your community. Can some of you raise your hands, please? Some of our psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists. I don't know how many of you are still here, but I met at least a handful of them today. And they're here in your local community, so hopefully they can also address things even after today, bi'idhnillah. Does that help? All right. With that, I will thank you all very much. Thank you so much, all of you who stayed this late, alhamdulillah. I hope this was beneficial in any way. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from us and forgive us for our shortcomings. And, forgive me for any mistakes in what I presented and said, if there were any. And anything that's khair, of course, come from Him. I just ask you for dua for myself, my family, and all these projects that we're trying to build out, that there's qabool ilahi, that Allah accepts them, and that we hope for your dua and your support. بارك الله فيكم والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على الهادي محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. جزاكم الله كل خير دكتور رانيا. May Allah bless you and reward you, and inshallah your trip back home inshallah be blessed and rewarded.